Hi and welcome to the VCE 20th Century Remote Teaching Podcast, Episode 6. In this podcast, we look at Nazi ideology and living in the Third Reich. This is part one of a two-part look at living in the Third Reich. In this particular episode, we'll be looking at the role of women and children in Nazi Germany. So Nazi ideology was quite clear on the role of women in society. Like many right-wing political parties, they advocated sort of like what they call a separate sphere principle, the idea that a woman's role was in the private sphere and the home, and that they looked after the family, while men made decisions in public life outside of the home and went out to work. So laws were introduced to actually barring women from joining the public service until they were 35. So they were also no longer able to sit on juries, vote. There were no female judges. Public prosecutors were forbidden from practicing. So higher education for women was discouraged, and the number of female uni students actually went from about 18,500 in 1931 to 5,500 in 1939. So girls no longer studied maths and science in school. Instead, their curriculum was focused on housekeeping skills, child rearing, and subjects which didn't enable them to qualify for university entrance. So the idea of motherhood was basically the ultimate career for women in the Third Reich. Mothers were idolised in propaganda, in their posters, generally portrayed as blonde, well-rounded, and very natural looking, and they were often in very traditional dress, surrounded by children. The Nazi ideal of motherhood was basically you wore no makeup or dyed your hair because this was considered decadent and a reflection on the Weimar era. So she was always depicted as looking quite neatly dressed and feminine. So in terms of the hierarchy in the Nazi society, just like the Soviet and French governments, they were kind of concerned with a falling birth rate and developed policies to up that birth rate. So marriage loans, they had child allowances and family subsidies, and they were offered to encourage couples to marry and have children. And in line with Nazi policy on women, being employed as a female was restricted and discouraged. So in 1933, under the law to combat unemployment, married couples received low-interest loans if the woman agreed to give up her job. The loans were reduced by a quarter after the birth of each child to encourage bigger families. So abortion and contraception became very difficult to access. Divorce was made easier for men wishing to marry younger, fertile women. So Hitler's mother's birthday became what they called Nazi Mother's Day. So medals were offered to women who had large families, and they were given to families who basically were rich in children. The bigger, the better. So children were to be the future Nazis, and of course it was only Germans who could prove their racial purity and had access to these benefits. So from 1933, forcible sterilizations were carried out on men and women who were or thought to have hereditary diseases. So if we think about it, women had a little impact on the development and implementation of Nazi policies in the Third Reich, even though many had campaigned for the Nazi Party before 1933. So feminism was derided, and being one of those ideas that came from the Weimar Republic. And there was sort of an ideal Nazi woman. She was blonde, she was attractive, and depicted in much of the propaganda of the time. Okay, so we had, I suppose the official face, if you like, of Nazi womanhood was a widowed mother of five, Gertrude Schlosskling, and she became what we called the Führerin, or the leader of the National Socialist Frauenskraft, or women's organisation. So a skilled speaker. Her main role was articulating the policies and programs of the Nazis in relation to women, and she wrote that it is the mission of the women to minister to the home and in her profession to the needs of life from the first to the last moments of a man's existence. Her mission in marriage is ... comrade, helper, and womanly complement of man. That is the right of the new woman in Germany. So more importantly, the role of women was seen as basically producing the next generation of soldiers. So a kind of weird use of women to produce the perfect racial stock was demonstrated in the Lebensborn program, initiated and supported by Himmler, who was the head of the SS. So if you translate that, it's loosely translated to spring of life. So the purpose of the project was to obtain genetically pure Aryan children for the SS to bring up as the new master race. So they had 9 maternity homes set up where women were selected and could meet their prospective SS partners and have their children. So some single mothers also had their children taken in by the SS after the outbreak of the war in 1939. Children considered racially suitable were kidnapped from countries occupied by the Germans and taken to Germany and brought up by SS families. So it's fairly out there. So we've got the idea of women who are homemakers, producers of the next generation. So what does the Nazi regime think about children and young people? So they thought it was quite important to capture the minds and the hearts of the young'uns, and Germany was one of those places where it was very important to instill that into the next generation to ensure, Hitler's power, basically. So one of the ways of influencing young people was to ensure that they were exposed to the words and the ideas of the Führer, aka Hitler, in their life. So whether it be at school or leisure or work or whatever. So young, loyal and nationalistic Nazis, it was kind of believed, would grow up being willingly taking up Hitler's ideas, I suppose, and willingly go into war against, Germany's supposed enemies. So in 1933, all youth groups, except a small number of Catholic groups, had been banned, and they'd all been sort of absorbed into Hitler's Youth, or the League of German Girls. So education was changed and reorganised along Nazi lines, and the party controlled games, books, sporting activities, the whole bit. So basically what we call Hitler Youth and BDM. Boys and girls were taught that they would play a very different role in the Third Reich. So girls between 10 and 14 joined the Jugendmarschen, which is Young Girls League, and then went into the Bund Deutsche Mädel, which was the League of German Girls, or BDM, between 14 and 18. So the next step was the Glauben and Schönheit, or faith and beauty girls. So these were the pin-up girls of Nazi Germany who were groomed for marriage and domestic life, and most of those activities were designed to prepare girls for future roles of mothers and wives, etc. So they were taught some racial theory, how to knit, how to sew, childcare, housekeeping skills. They were physically fit because it was seen that good health was needed to produce strong, healthy German babies. And sport and things like that, outdoor activities, were quite a large component. So when they finished school, they would put the skills to work, and they were sent to a family of 4 or more children, basically for a work placement. So the youth organisations were quite military in their nature. So the girls took an oath of allegiance to Hitler. They wore uniforms, had their own songs, flags, they marched in parades, and they also collected money and goods for the Nazi relief program and attended youth rallies. So not all German girls could join. For example, Vera Goldman, she was the only girl amongst 700 in her school who wasn't a member. So when she was 11, Hitler came to power, and she discovered her father was Jewish, therefore she could not join, and she had a different racial profile, so therefore she was defined as part Jewish. So the education of young Nazi boys began at the age of 10, and they learnt how to lay telephone wires, map reading, survival skills, marching, and also Nazi theory. So lots of camping. It was kind of like Boy Scouts, I suppose, displays, parades. They too wore a uniform. They were able to carry a bayonet, and really they acted as propagandists for the Nazi Party, really pushing that message across. They also developed some physical strength and fitness, and they were expected to undertake about 1.5 day country hike and scale a 60-metre fence. So at 14, basically the boys joined the Hitler Youth, where the training stepped up a level. So here, so at about 1935, there was a Nuremberg rally where Hitler addressed the Hitler Youth, and he said to them to be swift as a greyhound, tough as leather, and hard as Krupp steel. So Hitler Youth members carried out a lot of work for the Nazi Party. They delivered messages, they boosted up the numbers in parades, they collected money and clothes for the winter relief. So if you were quite enthusiastic, they would monitor the behaviour of young people, neighbours and friends, reporting any anti-German activities to the party. And the continual round of meetings, marches and activities pretty much kept them busy and away from home. So away from the potential that if their parents didn't believe in quite the same thing, they weren't being influenced. And if you're kept busy, you've got less time to sort of question what's happening. So both BDM and Hitler Youth members were encouraged to take the message of Nazism into their homes and, if necessary, report any signs of anti-Nazi activity to their leaders. So that could even include members of your family. So Hitler Youth members enter the party at about 18, and at 19 they went into the state labour service, where they were expected to work in the country on projects, a lot of manual labour, building, etc. Following this, they joined the armed forces, and enrolment into Hitler Youth became compulsory in 1936. So we've got two very different but yet similar paths for both boys and girls. But when it came to education, Hitler came really with this idea of rigorous academic standards, an old school system, and unfortunately he decided to rewrite the curriculum. So the focus became then on race studies, a lot of PE, leadership and religion for boys. Girls got a less academic education. And Hitler was also quite anti-intellectual. He said once, "I have no intellectual training. Knowledge is ruin to my young men, but one thing they must learn, self-command. They shall learn to overcome their fear of death under the severest of tests." So all teaching now was related to the Nazi program. So boys learnt about the Beer Hall Putsch in their history lessons. They calculated bomb loads and flight times in maths. And in their race studies, that became a really central part of the school curriculum, particularly in secondary school. And they would have charts comparing the racial characteristics of Aryan and Jews, and that was displayed and studied in class. So, for example, in biology, a teacher in front of a class could say, "Here's a Jew," and describe these features to his schoolmates. So basically racial profiling and quite derogatory prejudice content on the curriculum. Okay, well that ends part 1 of Nazi ideology living in the Third Reich. The next podcast we'll have a little bit look at how religion played a part, having a look at culture in the Third Reich, and we'll catch you next time.